Today it is my very great pleasure to introduce what Langston Hughes would call two guiding stars of the literary world, Natasha Trethewey and Tracy K. Smith. These two highly acclaimed poets have already, in their young careers, brought so much beauty, grace, and insight into the world that it fills my heart to see them together, knowing that we are about to share more of the same, they're about to share more of the same with us today. We have as our honored guest, Natasha Trethewey, who I have to say is a friend of mine. I never failed to say that. Natasha and Brett are very, very good friends of mine, so it's wonderful to have them here. Natasha Trethewey is the Robert W. Woodruff Professor of English and the Director of the Creative Writing Program at Emory University. She is the author of 4 poetry collections, Domestic Work, Bullocks-Ophelia, as I've told her many times, my personal favorite. I cannot now remember the first word I learned to write. Perhaps it was my name, Ophelia. Then the majestic Native Guard, for which she was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 2007, and now Thrall, which was recently published. She has also written a work of creative nonfiction entitled Beyond Katrina, a meditation on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. In addition to the Pulitzer Prize, Professor Trethewey is the recipient of numerous honors and awards, including the first annual Cave Canem Foundation Poetry Prize, the Lillian Smith Book Award, and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation. And then, in June of last year, James H. Billington of the Library of Congress announced Professor Trethewey as this year's Poet Laureate of the United States, the nation's 19th and the 3rd African-American woman to hold the post. Billington said of her poems, "They dig beneath the surface of history, personal and communal, from childhood or from a century ago, to explore the human struggles that we all face." In conversation with Natasha Trethewey is Princeton's own Tracy K. Smith. Tracy K. Smith is now, as I'm happy to announce, Professor of Creative Writing in the Lewis Center for the Arts. Congratulations. A graduate of Harvard and Columbia, and the recipient of the Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award and the Whiting Writers Award, Professor Smith is the author of 3 books of poetry: The Body's Question, for which she won the 2002 Cave Canem Poetry Prize, Duende, for which she was awarded the James Laughlin Award and an Essence Literary Award, and Life on Mars, for which she won the 2012 Pulitzer Prize in Poetry. The New York Times reported, "As all the best poetry does, Life on Mars first sends us into the magnificent chill of the imagination, and then returns us to ourselves, both changed and consoled." So, having noted the many accomplishments of these two wonderful poets, and they are just getting started, I'm compelled to quote one of them as you will look upon them on the stage. "My God, it's full of stars." Please join me in welcoming Natasha Trethewey and Tracy K. Smith.
Good afternoon. So what we'll do is I've got some questions for Natasha, and we'll talk for a while, and then eventually we'll open the conversation up so that if you have questions, and we can go from there. But my first question has to do with an aim that I've often heard you state as you know, one of your chief reasons for writing poetry, which is to write poems that will stand as monuments to our overlooked past. Often you've used the term erasure to describe what your poems are kind of seeking to undo. And so there's often this default of thinking about you as a public poet of public history. But there's also a really marvelous private dimension to your work that I'm really interested in. For example, your newest collection, Thrall, explores race and caste, but it also tells the story of your own family. Can you talk a little bit about the private dimension of your work and how you see the intersection between the public commitment that you have to history?
You know, Tracy, it's funny that you should say that, because depending on who's making that judgment, some people say my poems are deeply personal. It's as if they forget the historical component. And of course, I think that they are deeply personal and deeply historical at the same time, because I do try to chart the intersections as well as the contentions between our public history, our larger shared history, but also personal history, in the way that personal history always is bumping up against that, what is known, not known in the public sphere. And so, you know, my goal is to, first of all, examine the self in the ways that we do as poets, but to make sense of the self within a historical context. You know, I see myself, and I think having grown up in Mississippi, being born in Mississippi in 1966, thinking of Heraclitus's axiom, geography is fate, I am a product of a particular place and its history that I've inherited. And so for me, I've always been a historical being and always trying to make sense of my place in the world.
I'm really interested in the way that that quest and that ability to see is something that permeates so many poems. I thought I wanted to ask you to read the poem Elegy to begin with, but I'm thinking now of a poem like Enlightenment as something that is thinking about an experience that you and your father had visiting a site of American history. But it's also a poem that allows us to think about the story of America. And I feel like it's something, a version of that story that we're often afraid to address, or and a version of private experience that's sometimes painful. Maybe I will ask you to read Elegy, because that's a poem that also seems courageous because of what it's willing to say.
Okay. So shall I start with Elegy?
Start with that,
okay.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things about the poem Elegy, which is the first poem in my new book, Thrall, is that, you know, as I was trying to figure out where to place any of the poems in this collection and figuring out that Elegy had to start it, I thought back to a conversation that I'd had with my father many years ago. My father, who has been writing about me my whole life, and I'd gotten to the point where now I was beginning to write back to some of his poems. And so I said to him, you know, late one night that, you know, I was going to write some poems about him. And my father, you know, ever witty and intellectual and ready with a quote that should put me in my place, said, quoting Yeats, of the quarrel with others we make rhetoric, but of the quarrel with ourselves, poetry. And I said to him, that's okay, that's what I did in Native Guard, and I can do it again. Here's an attempt to do it, and to draw attention to my own complicity in our relationship as father and daughter, and the way that as poets we've written about each other. Elegy for my father. I think by now the river must be thick with salmon. Late August, I imagine it as it was that morning, drizzle needling the surface, mist at the banks like a net settling around us, everything damp and shining. That morning, awkward and heavy in our hip waders, we stalked into the current and found our places, you upstream a few yards and out far deeper. You must remember how the river seeped in over your boots and you grew heavier with that defeat. All day I kept turning to watch you, how first you mimed our guide's casting, then cast your invisible line, slicing the sky between us. And later, rod in hand, how you tried again and again to find that perfect arc, flight of an insect skimming the river's surface. Perhaps you recall I cast my line and reeled in 2 small trout we could not keep. Because I had to release them, I confess, I thought about the past, working the hooks loose, the fish writhing in my hands, each one slipping away before I could let go. I can tell you now that I tried to take it all in, record it for an elegy I'd write one day when the time came. Your daughter, I was that ruthless. What does it matter if I tell you I learned to be? You kept casting your line, and when it did not come back empty, it was tangled with mine. Some nights, dreaming, I step again into the small boat that carried us out and watch the bank receding, my back to where I know we are headed.
Thank you for reading that. That poem reminds us that the work of understanding the past is often something that can be ruthless or exacting. I'm really taken also by the emphasis on the word learned in that poem. I learned to be. Is it the craft of poetry that might have been one of those tools?
Well, I think it is about the craft of poetry, and also extending that to the idea of the craft of being a poet in the world. To be in the moment, so observant of the moment that it comes back to you when you sit down to make sense of it in a poem. When I was a little girl, I remember countless conversations with my father in which at some point he would almost seem to check out of the conversation, pull the little notepad that he kept in his front pocket out, and begin to write something down. And I always thought, what have I just said that makes my father want to write this down? What is going to be a poem that I just did or said to him? And that's what's happening to me in the midst of the poem Elegy. Instead of being fully in the moment with my father, I'm already imagining the poem I'm going to write about it. I'm already looking at it as if, oh yeah, that's a perfect metaphor for this or for that. I want to record this day so I can write about it. It's kind of like when you go to visit historic sites or beautiful places, you see some people who are not actually looking at them because they're behind a camera the entire time. Already sort of thinking of the object they're going to preserve rather than fully engaged in the moment. And so when I say I learned to be, it's a little bit about having that kind of almost out-of-body experience that a poet has, looking at the world for what might be made of it. But also, I learned it from my father, because that's exactly what he did when I was growing up.
I'm curious about the discomfort level that your father might have with that poem in particular, or some of the other poems in which he's a prominent subject, and he's being regarded in a way that's honest.
That's right. Well, I mean, you know, as I said, because my father is a poet, he has been writing about me my whole life, and I think he's also, with great joy, anticipated me becoming a poet, but also with a great deal of trepidation because he knew I was going to set the record straight. And so, you know, he does now have to contend with another version of the story, another way to see our shared experience, which is, of course, what I'm trying to do with the larger shared experience of American history. Right. How we have shared accounts of events, what gets recorded on the landscape with monuments, with the namings of roads and bridges, what's in the textbooks and sometimes what's left out. That's the same relationship to personal history, where we remember, we recall events differently. And so with that particular poem, you know, my father really likes the poem. I think he encountered it in a magazine before he saw it from me. So he saw it out in the world before we'd had a conversation about it. And you know, I actually did a long conversation with with the Atlantic Monthly on their website about the poem, including some drafts. And in that, I discussed some of the conversations that my father and I have had about it. So, you know, for example, my father says, oh, it's a beautiful poem, but those weren't trout you caught, those were guppies. And, you know, I'm like, Daddy, I've caught trout before. I know what a trout looks like. But he was most upset with the way the poem seems to present him as not the greatest fisherman. That's what he was more worried about. And then, you know, he also said that, and this may be a way of preserving a lack of knowledge about something that the poem's trying to suggest. My father sees it as a pre-elegy. He sees it as a thing that makes him feel lucky that he gets to see a beautiful elegy written for him before he is gone. And yet, you know, I would point out that that's not what's being elegized in the poem.
Yeah. It's funny that the things that we are able to acknowledge and then that other knowledge that happens as a result of a poem that might just go directly to the unconscious. I wonder if the poem On Happiness, which is toward the very end of the book, is kind of a companion piece to this poem. Would you read that?
Yeah,
and talk to us about it?
Wrote this after that one, still trying to go back to that day and to continue to make sense of that day that we were out there. And it really even seems like a poem that was written later than the other one, I think, in that way. This is On Happiness. To see a flash of silver, pale undersides of the maple leaves catching light, quick movement at the edge of thought, is to be pulled back to that morning, to the river where it flashes still. A single fish breaking the water's surface, the almost caught taunting our lines until we give up at last and turn the boat toward home. Is to see it clearly, the salmon rolling, showing me a glimpse of the unattainable. Happiness I would give my father if I could. And then is to recall the permit he paid for that morning, see it creased in my back pocket, how he'd handed it to me, and I tucked it there, as if a guarantee.
Which of the poems, and I guess I'm not just speaking about the poems in Thrall, but if you want, I remember reading an interview with you soon after Belloq's Ophelia had come out, and you said that one of the reasons why that persona became helpful to you is because you were pushing yourself to step outside of the I, the real I. And so I can imagine that a lot of the poems that we as poets write are designed to teach us something or to challenge something that we're comfortable with. And so I wonder which of the poems of this book or others might have been the most difficult for you, either because of, you know, how they were built or